Welcome back to Superbly Said Advanced English Vocabulary and Phrases.
Yeah, it is really great to be back here.
Quick reminder, you can go to SpeakDuo.com to meet new people from around the world who are practicing English on video calls to become more confident with their English speaking abilities.
Definitely a great resource.
So today's critique examines a SpeakDuo lesson presentation designed to teach advanced English idioms, featuring expressions like make it a blast and play devil's advocate.
Let's just dive right into the first piece of feedback then.
The current vocabulary definitions establish a solid baseline, but they miss the opportunity to explore the nuanced shades of meaning necessary for truly advanced English mastery.
Right. I mean, if you look closely at the provided definitions, the weakness is that for an advanced lesson, the explanations and examples are just slightly too straightforward.
They really are. They severely lack environmental context.
Exactly. The material seems to assume the learner just needs the direct, literal translation, like defining shoot down an idea merely as rejecting it quickly.
Yeah, which is true, but it's not the whole story.
Right. What this approach fails to address is how these phrases compare to similar idioms or how their tone drastically shifts depending on if you're in a casual setting or a high-stakes professional environment.
So the suggestion here is to introduce comparative analysis against similar but different alternatives to highlight those nuanced differences.
I completely agree.
And also incorporate highly context-specific examples, like formal workplace scenarios with a boss or colleagues, or even structured environments like an IELTS Speaking Part 2 response.
Yeah. We really need to move beyond simply defining the phrase and start defining its boundaries. What if we looked at it from the perspective of distinguishing active versus passive language?
Oh, that makes sense. Like with shoot down an idea?
Exactly. Instead of just defining shoot down an idea as to reject quickly, we can compare it directly to dismissing an idea.
Right. Putting those two side by side shows the behavioral difference.
Yeah, because shooting an idea down implies an active, sometimes aggressive verbal rejection. You might see a manager actively and sharply criticizing a fresh proposal in a team meeting.
It creates a really vivid visual of taking aim at something and destroying it.
Right. Whereas dismissing an idea can be entirely passive, like a colleague simply waving a hand and changing the subject without saying a single critical word.
Well, let's apply that comparative framework to the phrase play devil's advocate. Currently, the material defines it plainly as arguing the opposite position to test an idea.
Which is, a bit dry.
Very. To elevate this, provide a concrete example where an IELTS candidate uses this phrase to navigate a complex narrative about solving a team conflict.
Oh, that's a great context.
Yeah, the candidate could explain how purposefully arguing the absolute exact opposite position successfully tests the plan or uncovers potential problems during a sensitive group dialogue.
Setting the idiom inside an IELTS context shows the learner exactly how to use it to demonstrate high-level analytical thinking.
But I do have to push back a bit on this approach, though.
Oh, why is that?
Well, aren't advanced learners looking for quick conversational fluency rather than academic, almost surgical comparisons of word meanings?
I hear you, but
I mean, if they are hopping on a video chat to practice, mapping out the precise tonal differences between shoot down and dismiss might feel like an unnecessary academic exercise when they just want to chat naturally.
I see your point, but I would argue that advanced learners desperately need this exact type of surgical nuance precisely to avoid catastrophic conversational disasters.
Catastrophic disasters? Like what?
Well, at an intermediate level, the goal is just being understood, right? But at an advanced level, the goal is controlling your personal brand and navigating complex social dynamics.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, nuanced comparisons actually prevent awkward conversational missteps in high-stakes environments. Consider the fallout if an employee uses shoot down when they meant disagree with.
Oh, wow, yeah, they might accidentally accuse a supportive boss of being overly aggressive in front of the whole department.
Exactly. Nuance isn't an academic hurdle, Nuance is the armor that protects a learner's fluency in the real world.
That is a really fair point, which actually brings us to our next area of focus. Relying solely on open-ended breakout rooms for practice leaves a critical gap in formally reinforcing and accurately assessing the learner's retention of the new phrases.
Right, because looking at the notes, the presentation relies heavily on sections labeled Breakout Rooms 1 through 4.
Yeah, featuring entirely open discussion prompts.
And while conversational practice is fantastic, the weakness here is that relying entirely on unstructured open dialogue lacks a formalized mechanism to verify if learners can actively distinguish the meanings of the idioms.
Right, from literal incorrect interpretations.
Exactly. What frequently happens in these open breakout rooms is the illusion of fluency. A learner might use a phrase perfectly by simply parroting the sentence structure they saw on the slide,
while secretly holding a completely inaccurate understanding of its actual boundaries.
Yeah, without a structured test, the instructor has no way of diagnosing whether the learner actually comprehended the figurative meaning or just memorized the soundbite.
So the suggestion to solve this is to implement a rigorous multiple-choice assessment at the end of the lesson.
A specific kind of multiple-choice assessment, right?
Yes, one that forces learners to differentiate the correct idiomatic meaning from highly specific, slightly tricky, literal, or unrelated distractors.
Instead of just asking them to use the word in a sentence, you force their brain to pause, analyze, and actively reject the literal interpretation.
Let me challenge the fundamental format of this assessment, though. Is a rigid multiple-choice quiz inherently too formal for an app-based conversational platform?
Too formal?
Well, SpeakDuo is marketed entirely around live, engaging video chats. Dropping a highly structured multiple-choice exam at the very end seems counterintuitive to the platform's core identity.
I can see why you'd think it risks ending the session on a sterile note. But what are the potential limitations to assuming a quiz must be sterile?
I mean, multiple choice usually feels like a standardized test.
It doesn't have to, though. Cleverly designed literal distractors actually enhance the conversational vibe rather than kill it.
How so?
Well, when you present an adult learner with an option that defines shooting down an idea as physically dismantling a massive aerial structure using highly specialized tools, it is inherently funny.
Oh, I guess that is pretty amusing.
Right? It highlights the comedy of the English language. Instead of feeling like a rigid exam, it functions as a collaborative puzzle.
It makes the assessment both fun and highly educational.
Yeah, it gives the learner something humorous to bond over, laugh at, and discuss before they finish their video session.
Okay, I am sold on the quiz idea. But before we actually run through what that quiz should look like, let's touch on the final major piece of feedback.
Ah, right. The hook.
The introductory video hook introduces an engaging pop culture element that unfortunately disappears entirely from the rest of the instructional material.
Yeah, looking at the submitted deck, the very first slide prominently features a highly produced video titled, "The Stranger Things Cast Play Would You Rather?"
Which is clearly positioned as the hook to grab attention and set an energetic tone.
But the weakness here is a massive structural disconnect. You have this fantastic premise at minute 1, but none of the subsequent 10 vocabulary words refer back to this sci-fi universe.
Yeah, the initial hook is completely abandoned.
From a cognitive perspective, this makes the opening feel entirely disjointed from the core lesson, creating a fragmented learning experience.
So the actionable suggestion here is to weave the thematic elements of that introductory video throughout the practice examples.
Exactly. To create a cohesive narrative thread that holds the learner's attention from the first slide to the very last.
You essentially turned the vocabulary list into an ongoing story, using the pop culture hook as the environmental framework for teaching the words, like with the phrase, "God forbid."
Right. Now the material uses a highly generic, forgettable travel example about missing a flight for God forbid.
Instead, frame the practice directly around the show's sci-fi universe. Ask the learners, "God forbid the Demogorgon returns. What would be your strategy to get through it?"
Suddenly, the learner isn't just practicing a phrase. They are engaging in a creative, hypothetical survival scenario that perfectly encapsulates the dramatic nature of God forbid.
You can easily adapt the strategy for other idioms on the list too. For the phrase, "switch things up," instead of asking a generic question about changing a daily routine, ask how the cast of the show switched things up in their latest season.
Or how a specific character totally changed their usual approach to make life truly interesting.
But looking at the broader audience for advanced English lessons, does forcing a sci-fi pop culture theme onto professional idioms run the risk of alienating adult learners?
That's a valid concern.
I mean, if I am a 35-year-old marketing director taking a SpeakDuo class to learn how to spruce up my office, having to role-play survival strategies against a demogorgon might feel patronizing.
It is a highly relevant concern regarding audience alignment. If the entire lesson forces the learner into a strict sci-fi roleplay, it absolutely will alienate a professional adult.
So how do we balance it?
The goal is not universal application. The goal is strategic anchoring. You don't need to apply the Stranger Things theme to every single word in a heavy-handed way.
Just a few strategic anchor examples peppered throughout.
Exactly. You might use the pop culture theme for God forbid and switch things up, but transition back to a boardroom scenario for shoot down an idea. This creates a unified through line without forcing adult learners to pretend they are teenagers hunting monsters for an hour.
That makes perfect sense. So earlier we talked about that multiple choice quiz. I think we should actually conduct a quiz right now to show exactly how these literal distractors work in practice.
Oh, I love this idea. Let's do it.
All right, so we will announce the options as option A, option B, and option C while repeating the relevant phrase.
And for the listeners, feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer. Question 1. What is the best definition for the expression to make it a blast? Option A. To enthusiastically ensure that a specific gathering is completely exciting, remarkably fun, and highly enjoyable.
Option B. To totally carelessly accidentally trigger a highly dangerous physical explosion during a complex science experiment.
Or option C. To deliberately, aggressively, publicly criticize a highly unpopular corporate policy during a massive company summit.
So to make it a blast, feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct answer for to make it a blast is option A.
Right. Enthusiastically ensuring a gathering is completely exciting. Just like the example we discussed earlier about a fun social event. Not literally setting off an explosion. Exactly. All right, next question. How is the phrase to shoot down an idea accurately defined? Option A. To perfectly successfully execute a remarkably complicated strategic plan utilizing completely brand new technology.
Option B. To very quickly and remarkably strongly completely reject or actively criticize a specific proposal or a fresh plan.
Or option C. To physically, completely, permanently dismantle a surprisingly massive aerial structure using highly specialized tools.
So, to shoot down an idea, feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
And the answer for to shoot down an idea is option B.
Rejecting or criticizing a fresh plan, like our workplace example where a manager actively shoots down an idea during a corporate meeting, rather than just passively dismissing it.
Right. Moving on to question 3. If someone decides to play devil's advocate, what exactly are they doing? Option A, to completely accidentally strongly offend deeply religious individuals during a remarkably sensitive group dialogue.
Option B, to deliberately, maliciously, deeply manipulate an incredibly vulnerable colleague to successfully steal their project.
Or option C, to purposefully argue the absolute exact opposite position to successfully test a plan or uncover potential problems.
Playing devil's advocate. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct answer to play devil's advocate is option C.
Right. Purposefully arguing the exact opposite position. This goes back to our IELTS Speaking Part 2 example, where a candidate plays devil's advocate to demonstrate high-level analytical thinking to an examiner.
Spot on. Question 4. What does a person mean when they use the phrase, God forbid? Option A. A specific phrase utilized to express a remarkably strong and genuine wish that a terribly bad event will not happen.
Option B. A completely unexpected financial disaster directly resulting from an intensely irresponsible overseas corporate action.
Or option C. A strictly enforced historical religious rule totally preventing a specific local community from celebrating an event.
So, God forbid. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The answer for God forbid is option A.
Expressing a strong wish that a bad event will not happen. Like our pop culture hook example, God forbid the Demogorgon returns.
Exactly. Question 5. Which of the following describes what it means when someone is said to see red? Option A, to correctly, successfully, quickly identify incredibly small physical details within a remarkably complicated painting.
Option B, to remarkably suddenly and incredibly intensely become totally furious or extremely angry at a specific bad situation.
Or option C, to completely suddenly experience a remarkably massive drop in your physical stamina directly after a demanding race.
Seeing red. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
And the correct choice for to see red is option B.
Becoming totally furious or extremely angry, like we touched on when discussing emotional states in the workplace context.
Yep. Question 6. What occurs when a person manages to be into something? Option A, to completely, entirely, successfully, accidentally discover a highly valuable hidden physical treasure inside a cavern.
Option B, to intensely, physically, forcefully, aggressively insert a completely separate object right into a surprisingly tiny gap.
Or option C, to genuinely be incredibly interested in, completely focused on, or highly enthusiastic about a specific new activity.
To be into something. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The answer for to be into something is option C.
Genuinely being incredibly interested in a specific new activity, completely contrasting with literally discovering a physical treasure.
Exactly. Just 2 left. Question 7. What does it mean if you need to spruce up a room or item? Option A, to significantly properly improve the overall outer appearance of a specific thing by carefully tidying or decorating.
Option B, to completely violently, deliberately, forcefully chop down a remarkably massive, beautiful tree inside a natural forest.
Or option C, to extremely successfully rapidly utilize a remarkably great initial original idea to make ongoing continuous progress.
Spruce up. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct meaning for to spruce up is option A.
To improve the overall appearance by tidying or decorating, like the example of the marketing director taking a lesson to learn how to spruce up their office.
Yes. And finally, question 8. What happens when someone actively attempts to switch things up? Option A, to permanently accidentally reverse 2 incredibly important electrical wires, causing a remarkably dangerous failure.
Option B, to entirely, thoroughly, officially change your standard daily routine or usual approach to make life truly interesting.
Or option C, to continuously, highly obsessively micromanage absolutely every single tiny detail of a project until it fails.
Switch things up. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct answer for to switch things up is
Option B, changing your standard routine or usual approach, like we mentioned with the Stranger Things cast switching things up in their latest season.
well done on the quiz. It really shows how you can test these idioms effectively.
Yeah, it really does.
So, reviewing the structural journey of the material we examined today, the core takeaways revolve around depth, assessment, and cohesion. First, elevate your foundational definitions by utilizing nuanced comparative analysis.
Right, by actively contrasting phrases like shoot down versus dismiss and placing them in highly specific contexts, you transition learners from merely understanding words to confidently wielding them.
Second, fortify the assessment phase of the lesson.
Yeah, open conversation is essential, but adding a robust multiple-choice quiz designed with tricky, literal distractors forces the brain to actively process the figurative meaning.
It strips away the illusion of fluency and uses the inherent absurdity of English idioms to create a memorable, humorous learning anchor at the end of the session.
And finally, honor the promise of your initial hook. If you invest the time to capture attention with a pop culture element, weave that thematic narrative consistently through a few strategic examples in the lesson.
This builds a compelling, unified narrative thread that keeps the cognitive context intact for the first slide to the last. We invite the creator to make these targeted structural adjustments, which will absolutely maximize their students' engagement, and then submit the revised lesson materials back in for another critique.
Absolutely. When we analyze language instruction at this high of a level, It really comes down to respecting the complexity of what advanced learners are actually trying to achieve out there in the real world.
Yeah, to return to an idea from the broader philosophy of teaching, when you are working with beginners, you are giving them a simple paint-by-numbers kit.
Right, the lines are clearly drawn.
But when you are teaching advanced English, you aren't handing your students a basic kit anymore. You're handing them an incredibly complex palette with 30 distinct shades of blue.
Beautifully said. Help them understand exactly which shade to use and precisely when to use it, and they will undoubtedly paint masterpieces.